today, Joan, thank you for joining me
My
to come
pleasure.
and talk about Childline and how Childline started in South Africa. And I know that you are the founding person for Childline.
In a way, yes, and in a way, no.
Okay. Yeah.
But yes, I think, well, let's start at the beginning.
Let's do that, yes.
Okay.
So, Joan, what inspired you to be part of starting Childline in South Africa?
Well, I always felt passionate about children and enjoyed work with children, but also was increasingly concerned about the situation of children in South Africa. And Childline started in those pre-democracy years when all our welfare services were divided according to race. But because we were talking to children on the telephone, we didn't know where they came from, we didn't know what colour they were. You could guess maybe from a child's accent or from a child's use of language, but that was one of the exciting things about Childline.
Yeah.
That right from the start we were never kind of divided into those groups. We could just go ahead and work with children. So I was one of the original volunteer counsellors because initially it was a totally voluntary situation. You could perhaps have a call passed on to you in the middle of the night and you just got out of bed and took the call and did what was necessary. The real origins of Childline were in the multidisciplinary team at the old Addington Children's Hospital
In Durban.
Which unfortunately was closed by the apartheid government because the staff refused to turn children of colour away. And so the provincial administration closed the hospital. That meant that Childline had to find a new home, and it was a very informal, loose organisation at that time. So a colleague of mine, Felicity, and I had by then, in 1989, started a treatment centre for children who'd suffered abuse. And we were approached by the committee for Childline and said, look, you're basically working with the same kind of population of children. Could we not combine the two organisations? So the Child and Family Treatment Unit and Childline became one organisation.
Okay.
Moved into a premises together, and we ran the helpline and we ran the treatment centre.
Was the helpline free? Was it toll-free at that point?
No, it wasn't toll-free at that point, unfortunately. But we were already beginning to work with Telkom.
Okay.
And so the motivation was starting at that point. It only became toll-free, I would say, in about 1993 or 4. I can't remember the exact date. But fortunately, when there were problems with the hospital, Childline had a really forward-looking committee, a very passionate committee, and they were determined that the service would continue and it would continue to not be discriminatory. Okay. That was a bit problematic in the beginning, I must say. It's all very well to say you run a service that is non-discriminatory, but you are also using people who still carry that culture of apartheid in them. And we had some issues with staff and volunteers on the issue of culture and so on. Like our very first Zulu-speaking social worker, we had a woman on the crisis line who used to say to her, please go and buy cigarettes for me at the shop. And so
another volunteer.
A volunteer,
okay.
Yeah, a volunteer with no qualification whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so it took a while for people to realize, listen, equality is what we work with here. And no matter what your qualifications, no matter what your colour, no matter what your language group, we have to operate like that because we have to respond to children like that. So that was very interesting, but in the beginning, those kind of little issues. That was in 1991, before we'd had our first democratic election. So people brought their histories into the space, and that was sometimes quite difficult. And then it just grew like Topsy from there. From Childline, KwaZulu-Natal, there was then a similar organisation started in Western Cape and Gauteng, and then gradually we moved Port Elizabeth, now Kubega. And then Northwest, then in Mpumalanga, then Bloemfontein. And we did have offices in Limpopo and Northern Cape. But one of the challenges is with management committees in some of the more rural provinces who believe the income coming into the NPO that they sit on the management committee is kind of shared with everybody.
I think that's an issue that you find around governance, that there's a need for that kind of training and development of management committees.
Yes, and I think governance remains an important issue with Childline and should be headed from the national office.
Joan, just going back to when you were talking about Childline starting because of assisting children with abuse. So when did it become formalized and a registered NPO, and was that KZN at the time?
Yes, that was 1986.
Okay.
It became formalized, but
Yeah.
the NPO number was because we were talking to everybody a bit of an issue. So it had to go through a process. There was also I think there was some resistance from the old government guard. Okay, so we had to work quite hard to get the NPO status through, and I think we got it through in 1991. Okay. And interestingly enough, the Child and Family Treatment Unit got their NPO number, then Childline, and then the combination, it was combined into one number. And those early days were tough. We struggled with funding. I can remember once, really battling on funding and governance issues relating to funding. I'm not a good administrator. I think perhaps you know that.
I do.
Yes. But, I mean, you learn as you go along. Absolutely. And we had a fabulous management committee.
Was the funding challenge because you were serving all demographics, or was it a challenge because of just being able to access funding, like the struggle we have now?
It's very similar to the struggle we have now, but we hit a very big bump in around about 1992, 93, 94, when we realized that children, if there was a case against a person in the family accused of abuse, and then the case was withdrawn in court, and those offenders went back into their homes, we found children stopped coming for therapy. So in order to keep children in therapy, that is when we started the offender program. We immediately had flack. We're more interested in offenders than we are in children. You could explain. We had a policeman who went to the press and said, look what Childline's doing, and so on. And so we had to really struggle to kind of reaffirm our commitment to children. And in actual fact, we thought the offender program would never work, but we wanted the children. So we didn't imagine that people would, that men, because we were seeing many men in that program, would actually change their behaviour. But it was one of the most successful programs that was run at the time. It was really an amazing program, and I feel very sad that hasn't continued as part of Childline's work.
You were involved in that for many, many years. When I met you, you were involved in that. The children that initially we were seeing as Childline, because we have a focus on gender-based violence, sexual abuse, rape, was it initially that as well, or did we kind of evolve into working in a more specialized field as the years progressed?
I think we evolved as years progressed, and again, I think in some ways that's an enormous gain because it's brought in funding, but it's also an enormous loss. Because take a child who's kind of not happy with their parent, okay, phone the helpline. Like my own daughter did once. She says, "Mom, I'll embarrass you. I'm going to phone Childline because you're so
report
strict."
you.
Yeah, to report me. So she did. I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
It was a confidential call. But we lost that kind of call and focus. And that is a preventative call. Because if the counsellor is skilled enough to say to the child, let's look at how that can be resolved, and they work it through, that child is not going to run away from home and therefore get into sex work and be exploited or get into a situation in which there's gender-based violence. And so I feel rather sad that we've become quite gender-based violence focused, and I think this is also a donor-related thing, that donors actually drive services, and they shouldn't. Need should drive services, not donors. They should not be telling us how to work with children. They should not be telling us how many sessions a child needs of counselling after an abuse experience. Every child is different. There's no kind of magic formula. So that was difficult in those early days, yeah. So we had ups and downs. And then once there were all these offices around the country, we saw the need for a national office.
Yes.
And then I left Childline KwaZulu-Natal and opened the national office in my own home.
Yeah, I was going to say, in your lounge.
Yeah, well, it was downstairs. It wasn't in the main lounge.
Okay.
Yeah, it was downstairs. We had this room. Kids were leaving home by then, you know, so we had the space.
Yes.
And what was rather nice is KwaZulu-Natal is very hot, so I often used to start work at about 6 o'clock in the morning, go for a swim, and then sit in my office in my swimming costume, and then my dear husband Gavin used to say to me, just you wait, I'm going to take a photo and post it online of you at work in your office for Childline, sitting there in your swimming costume, which he never did, of course.
Yeah.
Big tease. Yeah, and that was, it was actually really nice to be working from home, to be honest with you, because I could work when I wanted to. Which was possibly all the time because those early days were also hectic, establishing the national office. And that's when we finally got the toll-free line, round about then. Might have been a bit earlier. It was a bit earlier that we got the toll-free line. And in fact, our first national coordinator was not me. It was a woman that Telkom wanted us to employ because they'd given us, you know, the donor decides. And she did absolutely nothing and was paid this wonderful salary. So we eventually said to Telkom, this is not working. And she left. And then I said, okay, I'll take it over and drive this. And from there, the national office grew. Then funding remained a big problem for the national office because, and here I'm going to get back into colour issues. I was the wrong colour for government to feel comfortable funding the national office. So I was in London, there's something else I must talk about, but anyway, I was in London doing something else and I phoned Dumasile, who was working in London, and I said, Dumasile, don't you want to come home to South Africa and take over my job?
Yes.
Now, I know that this was probably not the most legal way of going about appointing someone in that position, because you're supposed to advertise and so on. But Dumasile was the most fantastic social worker when she worked for us in the 1990s. She was just amazing. And I think she was exactly the right person because she's got more administrative skills and she had that international experience working in London as a social worker in a child protection team.
Yeah, I remember I was part of the directors group at that time, just before Dumi joined Childline South Africa.
And then government said, we'll fund you. So we got that funding, and they funded us, and they funded a salary for me. They wanted me to stay on for 2 years and to kind of mentor Tomasile, which I did. And then I moved into training and fundraising for the national office. And then I thought, no, it's not fair for me to stay on. Kind of the old director and the new director doesn't work well. So I resigned. And the very month I resigned, the disability hit me. But Childline remained my family. I had visitors from them every day. They brought me my computer. They massaged my legs and did everything. Childline is a family.
Yeah. And we feel that you are family. When you were very instrumental in setting up the Childline offices in the provinces, what are the challenges that you faced? Because I'm sure, there were different challenges in different provinces.
Yes. First of all, is it going to work, and will we get funding? So we had to raise funding for the provincial offices from the national office when they started up. So we did that. And, you call on friends, family, and other contacts to help. Limpopo, my daughter and her husband
were they
provided all the furniture and so on. But we also had other problems, and I won't name the province. We had quite a lot of finuckery going on in one of the Childline offices, and we had to close it down and restart it. And they had no financial statements. They couldn't get financial statements because of the corruption there. And you can't get funding without 2 to 3 years financial statements. So I went to a very special donor, and Ricki, what amazes me is there must be someone up there who loves Childline, because the donor that we got to restart that office, I was going home on an airplane from Johannesburg. It was a very drunk man in business class. And we had this guy who was sitting, I was in A, this other guy was in C, and B was empty. So they removed this man from business class, and as kind of like a punishment, he was sitting between us. But because he was a little kind of inappropriate, he started asking both of us on either side of him, what do you do, what are you involved in? And then the other guy in C looked at me and said, but my dad loved Childline, and he loved children. He was going home for his father's funeral. And his father had been shot when he stopped on the freeway to take a phone call. His father was a minister of religion with the Lutheran Church. And from then on, he became passionate about supporting us. And over the years has given us millions. Okay, I don't know if he's still around. I loved him to bits. He was quite different from our usual donor. I used to get phone calls, Joan, where are you? And I used to say, I'm in Johannesburg, but I'm leaving on a flight at whatever time. Don't worry about the flight, I'll rebook it for you, but come and see me. And I always knew that there'd be something for Childline. I did that.
I remember that story, you sharing that story with me, and what an important donor and relationship you had with him, and what they did for Childline.
Amazing.
If we look back to the journey, that Childline, or that you took with Childline, what do you feel were some of the milestones that the organisation reached as it unfolded?
Well, there were so many. First of all, when I became a social worker, and I did jobs that were not the best in terms of where my heart was. So I became a probation officer, and then I moved on to treatment of addictions. And then I just found my niche at Childline.
Yeah.
So it kind of matched where I was as a mother and in terms of my professional interests. So one of my highlights, interestingly enough, was not getting a job that I had applied for. Because I then thought, what now?
Yeah.
And then the whole child and family treatment unit opened up, and Childline joining that. And I realized I hadn't got that job for a reason. It became so much less important. Yeah. The highlights were always opening up the offices in the provinces and then opening up the national office. That was a real highlight. But one of the other things that started to happen is we were the first Childline in Africa, and then we started to train in other countries. So when I was a social worker, I thought this is kind of a lowly job in which you serve people, and that was really my passion. But suddenly here I was traveling all over the world.
Yeah.
Amsterdam, Morocco, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique many times, Uganda, Kenya, all of these places, and Botswana, Namibia. And then we joined the international organization, and then it was the States, it was Australia, it was really, I mean, me in all these places. It was fabulous. Those were highlights. The one thing I regret is that I never ever kind of managed to take a lot of leave and really explore some of the wonderful places I've been, except for Japan, where Dumi and I went backpacking together for a couple of days. So those were really good times when I travelled with a staff member. Like I went with a staff member to Malaysia, and it gave us a long stretch on an airplane. We used to talk and talk and talk and learn so much, you know, from each other, particularly when I was travelling with someone from a different culture. And those were really special times. Then we used to try and bring that knowledge back, because not only were we training, we were also exposed to different kinds of training there. So those were some of the highlights. And I hope everybody in Childline will have that opportunity, because it opens up your whole world to different possibilities. And just to say, ISPACAN has just started a free course that is going to extend over a whole year in child protection. And so please tell your staff, because although it's not CPD rated, continuing professional education rated in South Africa, I'm pretty sure that once they got the certificate and it's on their portfolio of evidence, it would be accepted by the professional board. It's free.
Joan, so I know you for over 20 years.
That's scary.
I was a very new social worker when I met you at the Childline National Meeting, and you're regarded as the person to go to, you know, with regard to child protection. You've been involved in the development of legislation, you've trained internationally, you were the president of the International Society of the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. You've presented at countless conferences. You spoke about your training. What drew you as, I would say, as a social worker and as a person to working in the child protection sector?
Well, I had a very difficult childhood, okay, and I think that had a lot to do with it. When we arrived in South Africa from England, I was very English and proper. My father left the family and completely disappeared off the face of the earth. And my mom's qualifications weren't accepted here. And she fought to keep us in her care. But it was hard. I mean, I went through a stage when I didn't have the appropriate clothing for school, when we didn't have appropriate stuff to eat. But my mom was determined. We would all finish school and we would all have tertiary education. I can remember registered for university and having nothing for my fees. And I said to my mom, I don't think this is going to happen. She says, of course it will. I'm praying about it. I mean, that was her faith.
Yeah.
And it happened. And her passion about her children became my passion about children, my own and other people's children. So I had this great shining example in my life. And I often talk to my mother, although she's not here, you know, hi Mom. But, you know, her wisdom and her... And nobody was unacceptable. My mother used to talk to the bus drivers. In fact, we even had a bus driver come for tea one day. Long before apartheid was finished, we had, you know, for her, God was a God who accepted all people, no matter who they were, what they were, whatever. And I think that was an example she gave us, And we were never, as children, growing up in this difficult situation, which was truly difficult, we were never allowed to badmouth our father. Never. And I mean, it was sometimes difficult because she eventually had him traced and took him to court for maintenance, but he never used to pay. So we used to think, okay, we'll go to the maintenance court and there'll be money for school shoes. And we used to go to the maintenance court and there was no money for school shoes. And there were times when I felt bitter and angry, and she used to say to me, listen, your father was a prisoner of war for 5 years under the Japanese. How can you expect him to ever have recovered from that? Because we didn't know about trauma then. That interested me in trauma work. You know, my own father's history. So that's really what put my feet on this path.
You actually lived the experience of so many children in this country.
Yes, but there was always some kind of provision, you know. And when materially there wasn't, there was this wonderful soul who kind of kept our faith going. And that was very special. And I also have a very special brother. Okay, I can remember many a time when I was working for Childline, Arthur, we've got an exceptionally needy child. Can you just support this child for a while? And because my brother was a very wealthy businessman, I mean, you didn't earn in social work, but he used to then say, okay, I'll sponsor her for a period of time, or I'll buy the school shoes, or I'll do this, because he also knew what it was like to go without. There are so many good things about Childline and the people who've worked there. In fact, I think we're very privileged at Childline to work with people whose main interest is not their own selfish needs, but to really work with people who have a desire to make the lives of children better in this country. My deep sadness, though, about South Africa is that the plight of children has not really improved. What I'd like to see more of in Childline is advocacy. And here, looking at you because you're in Western Cape where Parliament is, I'd like to see Childline going into Parliament on every occasion that they have offered to them and saying this is not right. It's not right that we have delayed the legislation that keep children safe online. It's not right that we have a Children's Act that is not implemented. I'm passing that on to you.
You're passing the baton on to me.
Yes, definitely.
I'll take it.
Okay. It's online now.
So for me, like, I agree with you, there's so much uniqueness, you know, in every Childline office. And if I think about the Western Cape, I think about our Child Witness Project. And
Oh,
just
yes.
how that has evolved. You know, we took it over from another NPO, and just how over the last 10 years that has grown and evolved, and how much we have learned from that service in particular.
Well, I want to tell you something about your Child Witness project. I should have mentioned it. Sometimes at Jelly Beans, when we're seeing children in therapy and they've been to court, they mention your work at the Child Witness project, because we always say, did you get enough support when you were going through court? Because court is so tough for kids. Yes, I saw the social worker there. And they name the effectiveness of that project for preparing them for court and supporting them through court, which is absolutely critical, because when children go through court, they are cross-examined just like adults are, and they come out of that feeling really battered. And for some children it's worse than the abuse itself. We have at JB a foster family in which every child was abused, 6 children, you know. And they come out of court, all 3 of the girls came out of court saying, why was I asked that question? It's like I am at fault. And yet the social worker picked them up and held them safe. So you can be very proud of that Child Witness project.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you for sharing that. I'll pass that on.
Please do.
To the team, because you know, very often, and you would know this, you're so busy in the work, you don't have time to reflect, you know.
Yes.
And the work that we do, as we were saying, we work with trauma, and trauma is so complex and so layered that we just working with one child after the other, because as you're saying, the services are just not enough to meet the needs of the children.
And the other positive, and I think this is Western Cape and a lot of the other Childlines, we've also recognised that staff mental health is important and volunteer mental health is important, because when you work with trauma, every working day of your life, it somehow or other kind of can really harm you and your relationships. We have our own families, and I think the one thing that stands out in my mind from many years ago was we had someone on the crisis line who used to phone in and say, you know that director of yours, Joan Van Niekerk? I'm going to kill her. And he phoned several times. It was very distressing to our volunteers, and we put certain things in place, and I also talked to my husband about it. My children were all teenagers. I talked to my teenagers about it. And one night I got my lift responsibilities muddled up, and I forgot to pick my child up from swimming, my teenage daughter. And she, quite late, I was saying to Gavin, where is Judy tonight? And she burst into the house. She took one look at me and she said, I thought you were dead when you didn't come to pick me up. And it really brought home to me is you carry this stuff, and you carry it to your family even though you have no intention of doing so. And I realized, it was the worst forgetting that I could have forgotten.
Yes, I hear you. And I think in the country that we live in, we are exposed to trauma, you know, generally as society. And then working with people who are traumatized, I agree with you. It does, as hard as we try and as much effort as we put into not wanting to affect us, we are human beings, and it impacts us. So that's something I'm really proud of, is that staff wellness is important to us, you know, at Childline in the Western Cape. And over the years it's evolved, and we've looked at how we can support with limited resources, but also not compromising services. And so I'm really thankful that I have a board that supports that as well, because there's so many organizations where staff wellness is it's not even on the table, or it's seen as a luxury.
Not really necessary.
Yeah.
So where are you going next?
What do you mean?
With Childline Western Cape.
With Childline Western Cape. So we are actually in the process of strategic planning, Joan, and it's been quite a journey. And I must say, something you mentioned earlier about families who are in need, that's something that we're picking up. You know, we're working with children, but we're realizing that we actually need to be working holistically. So trying to focus on working with a child, but a community where the child is in, so that we are not doing a hit and run, you know, because that's ineffective. And then we're also looking at expanding to rural areas and peri-urban areas. And we have some thoughts of a mobile Childline bus. That's my passion.
Oh, wow. I love that idea.
That's my passion. I see it as a way of, it will be a big investment, but it will be a good use of resources.
Fantastic.
Where we can reach out. And I mean, we find particularly the Atlantis area and beyond, there's a great need there, as well as in Paarl and beyond. So we've picked this up through our Child Witness project, and so that's one of the things that we are looking at as well. And
that is fantastic.
And then also looking at how we can take our expertise as Childline Western Cape and share that and empower other professionals with the skills that we have working with children.
So is a conference on the agenda?
Yes, a conference is on the agenda.
Yeah.
You'll be our keynote speaker.
No, you can.
But definitely, I think the thing that we are finding, and there's lots of requests coming in to us for training, you know, and sharing of our knowledge, is that people are hungry, that they want to learn, they want to be empowered. They don't know how to engage with children. They don't understand trauma, you know, and so we are really wanting to use what we have and make a difference in that way.
And there's so much wonderful research now on the impact of trauma on the brain and the functioning of the brain. Oh, I wish we'd known this years ago.
Yes, I had a very interesting conversation a few weeks ago specifically about that with somebody, is how trauma from in utero, how it affects the brain, and just the kind of work that we can do to shift that. Yeah.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
And I hope that you will also develop advocacy team for Parliament.
Yes.
Yeah, because our Children's Act is coming back.
Yeah.
Our new legislation on online safety for children, I hope, will come into Parliament in this kind of whatever. Yeah.
Joan, do you want to talk a little bit about what the process was like, or how it was for you being so involved in the development of legislation initially?
Oh,
With the Children's Act?
It was so exciting. It really was, because Nelson Mandela, we know, had this passion about children.
Yeah.
So when he came into power, every piece of legislation relating to children he wanted reviewed. So Children's Act, Child Justice Act, dealing with children in conflict with the law, Sexual Offences Act, looking at sexual abuse of children. So we had these three so-called expert committees at the Law Commission who were working on developing this legislation. But you won't believe it. With every election, something else became more important because of the adult vote.
Yeah.
So the committee I was working on expanded from sexual offences on and by children to all sexual offences, including adults, because they wanted the woman's vote. That was in 1999.
Yeah.
And then after the election, nothing happened. the researchers were taken off the project. And I can remember going up to the SA Law Reform Commission, and I'm embarrassed to tell you, but I got hold of the head researcher and I said, what's happening? He says, Joan, other things have become more important in government's eyes. And I burst into tears. Can you believe it? And I said, but you can't do that. You can't just stop this whole legislative reform. And of course, Mbeki came in, and Mbeki, I don't think had the same passion for children, you know, and that's no criticism of him. It's he was who he was.
Yeah.
So we fought to get this back on the table. And then we got it back on the table in 1991, 1992, 1993. And then it was not until the early 2000s that we really got going with the legislation again. 2002 we finished our research. But that was really, really hard to see that whole process kind of get squashed. And then when it was time to resurrect it again, it was very difficult. Children's Act passed 2005, Sexual Offences 2007, Child Justice Act 2008. I mean, really, 12 years into democracy, and we still had not reformed that legislation. However, we did not give up. Fortunately, I think that we managed to infect some of the junior researchers in the Law Reform Commission with a passion. And because they were junior, they had children, so they realized the importance of what they were doing. And then, it was all implemented in 2010. But it's been implemented very poorly. We don't see much change in the courts with the management of sexual offences against children. We don't see much difference in terms of poverty and children. In fact, I think we've never had such high level of stunting and deaths as a result of malnutrition. And I find this heartbreaking. And I'm sure Nelson Mandela must turn in his grave in terms of what is happening now.
Because it's one thing to have good legislation, it's another thing if it's not implemented, if resources, you know, are not put in place to effect and implement that legislation.
And we led the world with an inclusion of a special section in our legislation relating to children. And that was advocacy from the children's sector, which the Childlines were very involved in. So the Law Reform Commission process was fascinating, and of course we've just finished another one on children and pornography and child abuse images. So that was finished in the year 2020, but that's still sitting with Justice, who've not acted on the Law Reform Commission's recommendations. So we are busy activating for that today with, with the Department of Social Development.
And I think that's always going to be our role, as you say, advocacy. It's a critical part of what we do in child protection.